Psychoanalysis and history. Society, history, pathology. Dark colors in the big other. Namaste. Psychopathy need not be limited to a few individuals. Consequences of pathology also need to not be limited to an individual's family and surroundings. Pathology can at times have for its scope of action and consequences society at large. Conversation today is at the crossroads of psychoanalysis and society in the canvas of history with our guide psychoanalysis consultant, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Do we not start with a definitional problem? If the society has something pervasive, can it be called a pathology? And corollary to this is, can society then ever have a pathology?
It's a good question because it takes us straight into the center of definition of pathology. There are various ways of defining a pathology. One way is to have a reference of some ideal and compare what we want to investigate with that ideal. And second is to have a reference of the average. DSM is largely based on the definition of pathology referencing to the average. In that sense, DSM is not strictly a scientific document, but a socio-scientific document. In a way, it is definitely not art, but also not definitely completely a science. Somewhere in between, it's a craft which is leaning on the side of science. If we look at sciences and divide them into two, soft sciences and hard sciences, psychiatry would fall under the category of soft sciences. So that is one way to look at it, that if we believe that what is pervasive in society, what is an average, cannot be pathology, then obviously corollary of that is there cannot be anything called a social pathology. Because if everyone is sick by something, that is not sickness then by definition. The other way of looking at it is to index or reference the subject of investigation to an ideal. And we say, even if the entire society has a problem, it can still be called a problem if we don't reference it to an average, but we reference it to an ideal. For example, if we look at Hindu psychology, it is very clear that anybody who is not enlightened is psychologically sick. Now, that is where the gold standard is much higher. And by that idea, the whole society is sick and they don't have any problem with that. Similarly, we can take the example of COVID. That because everyone in society has COVID does not mean COVID is not a sickness. Same way, even if the entire society has a psychological sickness, that does not make the psychological sickness normal. If the entire society has it, then the entire society is sick. And therefore, in cases where something is very pervasive, it is better to look at the definition of pathology as referencing to an ideal rather than referencing to an average.
Average.
Now, this is something which is peculiar to psychiatry. This hesitation of calling something pervasive as sickness. In psychoanalysis, this was never the problem. And ironically, even in Hindu spirituality, it was never a problem. The entire society can be sick if there is a sickness pervading across. And in psychoanalysis, we always had this tradition of recognizing many of the social sicknesses. For example, look at social scale pathology in two ways. One, social scale pathology, which is universal to the whole of mankind at any given point in time, number one. Number two, look at a universal pathology common to the whole mankind over history. one of the most pervasive things you can ever think of. And three, look at a society-wide pathology, but limited to a society. All the three are social scale pathologies. Take one by one. Freud used to say that belief in God, belief in religion, belief in the afterlife is the universal neurosis of mankind. So, because we are not able to cope with the anxiety that this existence creates, we have to invent God, we have to invent afterlife, we have to invent justice in order to be able to deal with the anxieties and the aggressions of life. So this, according to him, was a universal neurosis of mankind. And this universal neurosis, if you look into it in terms of the scope, it was across the world. And not only across the world, but across the time span of history. So this was, according to Freud, a universal neurosis of mankind, which was over history across the world. Then we look at Karl Marx, and he used to call religion the opium of the masses. And by that, he also meant it was across the world and over the historical time. He did not use the word pathology, but the main meaning was the same. So both of them referred to pathologies which were across the world and across history. Now come to a slightly more circumscribed pathology across the world at any given point in time. Take, for example, the whole idea of chastity belt, which was in Europe, a pathology circumscribed to a continent in a particular time of history. Take, for example, hysteria, very common across the Western world in a particular time of history. Take, for example, in some tribes, what Freud had learned from anthropology, that there is this custom of eating the dead father
Oh,
or eating an animal which is symbolic of the dead father.
oh,
Now, that kind of pathology or sacrificing human beings at a particular day in order to get something, or sacrifice certain things, or punish oneself on one particular day of the year, and punish oneself so brutally that one is bleeding. One can see that even today in Muharram. And there are many
true.
such festivals across so many cultures where the punishment to oneself is pathological and at times almost without a reason. At least not something which is conspicuous or adequate a reason. So we see society-wide pathologies. Now, Freud also talked about pathology across society on an everyday lighter way. And he talks about in his essay, Psychopathology of Everyday Life, in which we look at jokes, slips of tongue, actions we do, which have such a humorous psychoanalytic meaning. And for psychoanalysis, it has always been there that the society, the pathology is universal, and there's nothing like a pathology-free individual or a pathology-free society. So when we look at this idea, we get it very clearly that one, there can be pathologies which are spread far and wide in society. Number one. Number two, these pathologies can have two elements to it. One, culture may be providing raw material to individuals in order to ultimately lead to a pathology, or culture may have a fully created pathology which is internalized by individuals who are subscribing to that culture. So I was saying that there, when we look at social scale pathology, we can look at it in two ways. One,
Hmm.
there can be elements that culture is providing as raw material in such copious amounts to its citizens that they manufacture pathology in themselves because of abundance of that raw material, which can easily lead to a pathology. It's a kind of a predisposition. But more than predisposition, it's actually supplying raw materials. And second, culture may normalize certain pathological elements, and everyone who grows in that culture learns it in the process of growing up. So we can look at two society-wide culturally driven pathologies. And Kohut said something very interesting here. He said that we often talk about the causality of pathology being biopsychosocial. But in practice, we only take into consideration bio and psycho, the child and the family dynamics. We actually don't factor in the social elements, but it's the social element, the cultural element is very important. He makes a very
Absolutely.
important point. He says, I no longer get the hysterical patients that Freud used to get because the culture outside has changed. It is not something that the human genes have changed so quickly. It is the environment which has changed. And therefore, he talks about two categories of patients. The guilty man, where there is repression of desire because of cultural repression. And that is the archetypical patient of Freud, the guilty man, a man guilty of his desires. Whereas he calls his own patients, Kohut's own patients, he calls them the tragic man. The man in whom the self has not formed in a healthy way because of early life object losses or inadequately good objects around you, where the mirroring, idealization, all those things could not happen rightly. So we see that pathology is a very
That
strong.
way, it also sounds like to
Yeah, please go on.
that I was just getting in touch with, like, if we see this today's era, it would be more of a fragile narcissistic men with histrionic fragile women around in the
Correct,
society.
correct, correct. So this is where the cultural driving of pathology comes in. That the pathology develops not only at home, but also because of an input from culture. And Lacan calls it the big other. The big other who is separate from the small other, the parents. So you have the child who is the I, and then the not I. The not I is the other. And the other can be divided into various parts. And one component of the other is the small other, the parents, and the big other, which is the law, the culture, the history, the system, the society, and so on, language. And Lacan gives a lot of importance to the big other in the psychic uh, life of an individual, both in pathology, in healing, and otherwise. And here we see that when we talk of raw material of pathology or fully formed pathology given by culture, given by the big
Mhm.
other, we are talking here of the dark colors of the big other. So this is very, very important. And one last point before we roll out the canvas fully, the conversation between Freud and Einstein.
Mm.
In Second World War, there was a very famous conversation between the two because
Right.
both of them were Jews and both of them had suffered losses of very close relatives killed by Nazis.
Nazi.
Uh, Nazis. Einstein wrote a letter to Freud asking him what was it in human nature that despite so much of mindless destruction, so many deaths, such suffering, people don't stop. One can understand that there can be an euphoria, a dreamy conceptualization of war till the war starts. But after first few days of war, when everyone has suffered the tragedies, why don't people come together to put an end to that tragedy? How can it go on for months and years? Because in the first initial few days, the whole romantic notion goes away, and people actually start realizing what war is. how troublesome, how inconvenient, how tragic. So many dead, so many widows, so many orphans, the economic development going back by 100 years, people tortured, people losing their hands and legs. I mean, it's a suffering all around. You are dropping bombs and suffering from the sky on everyone. So Freud's answer was that the forces of domination, aggression, destruction, revenge, of getting back into the state of absolute inertia, these forces are too strong for the forces of reason, love, compassion, reasonableness, empathy, happiness, and so on. And these forces, which they put together under the title of the death instinct, the drive towards death, the drive towards destruction, the drive towards inertia. So he felt that these pathologies were embedded in our hardware, and they were across the species, across the world, across the whole history. So when we talk about society-wide pathology, first, not only it is possible, it is there. It has always been there. There are social pathologies which have been with human beings across whole of history. There are social pathologies which have been with human beings in particular periods of history at particular countries or particular continents. And there are social pathologies which are specific to certain people, certain groups of people, because of which they keep suffering, but they can't give it away. One example, which we'll slightly see later in detail, is that of the Hindu mindset over the last 1,000 years. How we kept suffering, but we could not learn lessons and take remedial actions because of our own society-wide pathologies. So this is something that uh, we can roll out the canvas to start with and then get into various areas of what we are discussing.
Also, as Alaka mentions about the significant other, I feel every 150 years, there is a change of the ideals and the normals, definition of normals, which contribute to this, the entire concept of the mind frame shifting along.
Correct.
Maybe this level of brutality is okay for this era, where you're not just killing the men, you're killing innocent people who are not even the participants or not even the warriors, civilians, right? So
Correct.
now this is the normal. So this is the new normal. So nobody feels much offended about it. Similarly, other aspects also. So with the time frame, I think the normal and the ideals keep changing, which brings in the respective fluctuations with the individual's instincts and pathologies.
Correct. So here we are at the same point, like when we look at the foundation of truth. How can we say something is true? There are various ways of establishing something to be true. One of the dicey ways is the consensus of people.
Right.
Because if we take consensus of people as a criteria or a foundation for truth, it's a very difficult foundation because people can have consensus on anything. If you look at history at different points in time, people had
Yes.
very large scale, mass scale social consensus on very difficult things. At one point in time, slavery was all right in many parts of the world. People had a consensus that it was perfectly moral to buy and sell human beings and keep them as slaves.
Yes.
So people can have consensus on anything, and that's a very shaky foundation. Therefore, it's always better to have both these criteria in mind, the criteria of average and the criteria of the ideal.
Ideal.
Referencing to the average and referencing to the ideal.
So, how do we look at the Western society if we look at the society wide pathology?
If we look at present, let us say, if in today's point we look at the Western society, we clearly see society wide pathologies. psychological pandemics, unrecognized epidemics, pandemics, whatever you say, but society-wide epidemiological level psychological epidemics at least, and they persist. They pertain to one, loneliness, two, narcissism, three, fragility, fourth, fragile narcissism, fifth, weakness of the ego strength, loss of robustness and fortitude, uh,
True.
loss of realism, living more in fantasy world, online screen world, barbarism, amnesia, that because we are civilized, we forget how barbarians are across the border. Exactly what happened to Troy in ancient Greece and what happened to Hindus in the last 1,000 years. That we thought people across the Himalayas are exactly like us. We could never find out how the barbarians across the Himalayas were preparing to harm us, to plunder us,
Invade.
to conquer us, and so on. Uh, Another element of the present civilization is in the West, particularly, a loss of superego happiness. Like we look at superego more as a problem. We have a word called superego pathology, but we don't talk of superego strength and superego happiness. So happiness which comes from superego is completely out of the window. And that creates a lot of difficulties because it's a very lopsided development, not a rounded development. Uh, Development without superego is a development of deficits.
Deficit.
Then the difficulty of the three I's: inertia, indolence, and indulgence. And indulgence obviously leads to addiction and perversion. And then we have the demographic disaster that when everyone is completely lost in hedonism, temporary hedonism, nobody wants to take responsibility. And therefore, nobody wants to have children and raise children. It's a hassle. Everyone is singing the song, It's My Life. And if you sing the song, It's My Life, right? Obviously, you're not going to have children because they won't allow you to have your life your way. So then it leads to a demographic disaster. So at least 60% of the society has to be in the children raising mode. Rest of the society can say it's my life, but 100% society can't say it's my life. Now, because in the West it has been said, we see a demographic disaster in the West, and they are filling it up by immigration from countries, Asian countries. The question is, if the entire world was to do what they are doing, from where will you get immigrants? Because no country will have spare people to spare. So these are the difficulties which are society-wide psychological pandemics in the West as we see it right now. If you go into the root of it, why these pandemics are there, this at least an epidemic, if not a pandemic, but psychological epidemics. Certain things are very clear about the present state of the Western civilization. The first is they are completely cut off from nature. Second, completely cut off from mythology.
Hmm.
Completely cut off from one's archetypal nature. And are suffering object deprivation across their life. There is an old saying which says, it takes a village to bring up a child. And in fact, if you extend it, it takes a village for any human being to live healthily. Because we are very deeply programmed to be social creatures. And the moment one is lonely after some time, automatically anxiety and depression sets in. And therefore, it's very necessary to have adequate object attachments. Now, the way children are brought up in the West with super nuclear families, or I should say, micronuclear families,
Mhm.
many of them have single parents. Many of them have shifting parents and no parents for quite, only one parent for quite a long period of time. So the way they grow up in the back seats of the car all alone, that creates a very difficult object deprivation. And one of the reasons for pervasive, fragile narcissism, which is also at the root of wokeism from a psychoanalytic standpoint, is also because of early life deprivation of adequate objects. That there is no longer the village around the child to bring up the child. And we are programmed to be brought up in a village. And that is true of today, even of countries like India, where children are brought up in flats, in apartments, where there is no playground. They don't play with children. All they do is to go to school, come back, and be alone all the time. So, one part of it. Second, as adults, because we are not used to managing multiple relationships, we are not able to, as adults, create what is called a healthy attachment portfolio, where we have 5 to 7 strong attachments with people of different types. Some may be teachers, some may be friends, some may be lovers, some may be parents, and so on. But 5 to 7 strong attachments. Now, when you don't have that, and everything is invested in 1 or 2 attachments, if they start shaking, anxiety mounts. It's almost like a micro panic kind of situation. And it's true, natural, because you have invested everything in 1 or 2, and if they shake, everything is at stake. But if you have 5 to 7 strong attachments, you can balance the emotional portfolio. So then we have the deficit of holistic healing. That the allopathic healing has many defects, and holistic healing is still not there in the West. Then the lack of spirituality and the lack of natural music. These are some of the reasons why the list of social pathologies which we listed out, we see in the West.
So when we look at this broad term of social pathology, if we see the major suffering of the times, can we look at the World War II in the same way as a social pathology?
Yeah. We mentioned about the conversation between Freud and Einstein. And in World War II, like in most enduring brutal group conflicts, what we see is, psychoanalytically speaking, the split being open. The displacement of frustration and rage on a scapegoat. Desire for revenge of a historical wrong. And this is something very important. We don't talk in psychoanalysis adequately about revenge, but revenge is a very strong human emotion, like humiliation. Humiliation also is a very strong human emotion. Then we have the intergenerational rage, which leads to a social pathology of the type that we see in World War II. Intergenerational rage against a race, particular race. The historical part about it is that life becomes at times very hard. Too many desires are frustrated. Anxieties are very high. Humiliation is unbearable. Helplessness is unbearable. And at such times, the rage is evoked. And the rage then gets channelized by some charismatic leader onto some scapegoat. And the deeper psychoanalytic situation is such that people have, at an unconscious level, no choice but to do it. The difficulty is just too difficult to bear. It's humanly virtually impossible to be rational and maintain the control of the ego. So what we have is the id hijacking the superego, reducing somebody to a subhuman status, and then the guilt is taken care of. And then the whole rage in the split condition can go towards that object. So we see that. We also see that because of this psychoanalytic processes of the split open of unbearable frustration, humiliation, rage, of unbearable helplessness, of unbearable chaos, of desire for order and safety, of desire for greatness, of desire for self-respect, of desire for a good world. All of this at an unconscious level leads to perpetration of many of the social pathologies. And the situation in the unconscious is such that you get seduced by somebody who is omnipotent and narcissistic. And your inner chaotic situation is such that you believe that only an omnipotent narcissist can save me. A real person who tells you his strengths and weaknesses, he cannot save me. He is just one, he is like exactly like me. Somebody like me cannot save me. I can be saved only by somebody much greater than me, and that is somebody omnipotent. And obviously, the person who is putting himself into that omnipotent position cannot be honest. Consciously or unconsciously, he is playing into omnipotence. But the seduction is so high that people are not able to stop
Distinguish.
themselves from getting drawn towards that person because the inner push is so much. Like Schopenhauer once said, people feel they are drawn from the front, but actually they are pushed from behind. Normally, we believe that what was in front of me, that was the cause of what I did, but actually, what was inside of me, that pushed me towards it. So, that often happens, and we see that this society-wide pathologies, the society-wide common psychoanalytic phenomena which lead to pathologies, they actually have created empires and destroyed empires. Just look at the releasing of pathology in World War II, and it destroyed two empires, the French and the British, and created two new ones, the American and the Russian. So, at a root level, this psychoanalytic phenomena will give rise to pathological thoughts and actions. And this chaotic psychoanalytic phenomena will happen because in the big other, the situations are so difficult that these psychoanalytic phenomena, very disturbing phenomena, they get created in the unconscious mind. So we see the complete chain from the big other to the unconscious of a person, creating those difficult psychoanalytic phenomena and actions, leading to pathological thoughts and actions, leading to a disaster in the outside world. And therefore, it is the dark colors of the big other. They play out through the unconscious into the society, leading to historical events. And that is where one part you can say the history creating history.
Right.
And it may also almost appear as though nothing can be done by human free will. But there are things that can be done in the long run. But if you prepare in the long run on an everyday basis, you can deal better when this kind of crisis phenomena happen, where the darkest colors of the big other propel the unconscious into pathology. And we see even in ancient times of of Mahabharata, same situation, society-wide pathology, and nothing could be done except to have that war in order to overcome the evil of people with pathological minds. It's easy to say, eh, we should kill the evil in the evil man, not the evil man himself. But often the evil man is so associated with the evil in him,
Even.
the two go together. It's not possible to separate one from the other. And that is what happened in Mahabharata. Even Krishna could not separate the evil from the evil man. He could not transform them. He could not separate the two. He could not neutralize the two. There was no choice but to kill the evil by killing the man in
Eradicate.
sides. The two go together. And when that kind of situation happens in history, that the two go together, then we have no choice but to take those difficult decisions which are necessary to control evil. And in that process, hundreds and thousands die. It's a very cruel choice. If you look at World War II, it's almost like a modern Mahabharata. And if we look at the situation which is emerging right now in the world, uh, we may be looking at a mini Mahabharata, a mini World War III kind of situation. Again, we see the same thing.
Same thing.
developments in the big other, propelling psychopathology in the minds, leading to its acting out, and then the counter action by the victim, and then the cyclical actions from both the sides leading to what we see. So we see how the dark colors of the big other, they can create a society-wide epidemic of the psychopathological type. It's 1 minute to go. Should we take up the rest of it in the second part?
Yes, we continue with the part 2 of the same.